Hi, I'm Tony.
And I'm Patrick.
Welcome back again to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. We are working our way through Greg Bahnsen's book, Against All Opposition. So, there you have it. Yeah, he's quite a fighter here. And we worked our way to chapter 6. And this chapter is entitled, What is Philosophy? And as I was going through this chapter, I was saying, wow, this feels like almost exactly what I do when I'm teaching my intro to philosophy classes. So I was really comfortable with this chapter.
Yeah. All right, you've taken Philosophy 101. Why are you here other than it's a 101 and you needed to fulfill some prerequisite
credit? That's right.
Yeah. And then you get hooked because you talk about what is time, and you go, I know what time. Maybe I don't know what time is. Okay, I still have all my books behind me from my intro class, because each one was formidable. In Dr. Arthur Falk was my intro teacher.
Dr. Falk,
from Western Michigan University, and the very most I could say about him, and there's a lot that people say about him, for good and for bad, like everybody, but is that he made it interesting. And there was, in a lecture style setting, he made it so that people discussed the material, which was odd, because it's an intro class, and so you've got a lot of opinions in there, and he for an old spry guy, he was very spry. So
Arthur, man. I had him for 2 graduate classes. I had him for a class in epistemology on truth, and for an Aristotle class. So it was really fun with Dr. Paul. But so let's jump into it now. Bahnsen says that this may be the toughest chapter in his book, Against All Opposition. He says this one might lose people, is what he suggested. So he's kind of warning us ahead of time and asked us kind of stick with him until, we can get the basics down. And this clearly, from his perspective, where he's coming from with regard to worldviews and that sort of thing, is the basics, is what we're going to cover today. He says he's going to show us how to start dismantling the unbeliever's worldview. But in order to do it well, he tells us we're going to have to know what we're doing and what we're dealing with. So that's how he's kind of jumping us into this chapter.
Right. Yeah. So if you're kind of looking for the manual, all right, let's get to the meat and potatoes. You have to get. You're reading until chapter 7 to kind of get to the crossfire section, and so Bahnsen does a good job of showing out and laying out. It kind of reminds me of what we did for Dr. Anderson's Why Should I Believe Christianity? That he builds it so slowly and well to get to the main points, but you have to start with certain assumptions, certain ideas that you may not have kind of thought of before or looked at before. And so that's what Bahnsen is here doing on just what is philosophy. And you might think, what do we care about? Are grasshoppers beautiful? Like I should care about that. And he actually discusses something along those lines as well. So he says, I have told you that everyone has a worldview. You have one. The unbeliever has one. Again, that's why in the last 2 episodes, we talked about neutrality, not neutrality so much as, well, I don't really have an opinion on the subject, is that your underlying assumptions, you can't start with a neutral starting point. And so the short clips that we make on YouTube, someone said, you have to start with neutrality when you're talking about God. And that person was coming from a point of view of saying you have to start with no assumption on if there is or is not a God. And that's not the neutrality that's being talked about there. It's having neutrality on everything, including your basic assumptions. And so one of those things that Bahnsen says is that we can't be neutral on is having a worldview. Now, yours might be underdeveloped, it might be overdeveloped, it might be inadequate. Think about children. They have what they're able to take in from their just personal experiences, but they always go to their parents and ask, well, why is this the case? And so the joke of your children always asking you why until you get to some very philosophical points of view. So sometimes makes parents the best of all philosophers there.
Yeah. Well, kids are tiny philosophers as well. That's why they're asking questions.
That's right. And so you get to the point where you just go, well, because I don't know. Soon the facade will come down and they'll realize that we don't know everything. And that's when the rebellion starts. But when the unbeliever wants you to be neutral, he's trying to neutralize you to take away your worldview and then continue using his own, which amounts to winning the debate by default. The whole heads I win, tails you lose type of deal. He will not give up his or her presuppositions. It's impossible to do so. You must not give up your presuppositions. And again, this is something we want to point out. You can't do. It would be improper to do, and it would be especially for Christians, immoral to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so, everyone has underlying philosophy, says Bahnsen tells us. And he talks about this, he thinks about an individual, he says, who says something like homosexuals can't help what they do, right? And Bahnsen tells us that on that view of human nature, dictators can't help what they do either. If that's the case, and you're not going to oppose homosexuality because they were made that way, then what gives you the right to oppose dictators, for instance, who were also made that way? And the point he's trying to make here is that the person who says this has a profound philosophy, but it's not a philosophy that's in agreement with itself, right? It's inconsistent. In other words, the only way it would be consistent is we'd have to treat both kinds of folks in the same way. And obviously this person isn't doing this by, how they're characterizing their argument.
Right. And we could talk about this with serial killers as well. Well, sure, we might need to remove them from society so that they don't kill us all or kill, who their intended victims are. But we can't judge them. I mean, they were born this way. There's a flaw, and to even call it a flaw is in of itself a presupposition, because who's to say that the serial killer isn't the next level of human evolution to come about? And we've lived in some prosperity, and now it's time for the hard times, and we need the serial killers to come and round us and call the herd a little bit. But to then judge people based on varying other characteristics, well, why can't we just use the same basis there? So either there is choices or there's by nature, and to not distinguish between two, even if you say that there's a mixture for some and a mixture for others, to just unqualify those as saying, oh, we need to take out dictators because they're acting immoral, but people that do other immoral things, I support those people, and so or I don't want to judge those people because I might be judged, or what have you. There is where we run
are
into
inconsistent. That. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what we want. And the whole process now, especially the political process of pointing this out, and I forget who I was listening to this week of no one cares anymore about consistency, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't still do it, because we still, it might be preaching in the choir, but still the choir is there in the church to be preached to. And so we still need to talk about when people are being inconsistent, even if they claim that they don't care, because it's one of those things that you can, I think Doug Wilson says that you can only exist in an unreality for so long until reality comes crashing into your face. And so, so that's what we're doing here.
You can only think the wall doesn't exist until you run into it.
Right. Yeah. Nose meet wall. Hi.
That's right.
All right. So turning to the page of not all philosophy is good philosophy. The issue is not whether you do philosophy, but how well you do it. People do not decide to do philosophy. They don't just sit down and stroke their chin and, okay, I'm in philosophy mode. No, they're doing philosophy is unavoidable, and it's unavoidable today, yesterday, tomorrow, what you're probably doing right now, especially if you're listening to this, obviously. But if you're going shopping, if you're talking about education with your children, if you're watching sports, even in there, you're talking about philosophy. Oh, have good sportsmanship. Oh, well, why? You can get away with unsportsmanship. You take a penalty for it if you get caught, but let's try not to get caught. Or you have some esoteric view of the goodness of the game that you want to preserve, and so you talk about the heels or dirty players and stuff like that. So even in sports, you're talking about philosophy. So it's not whether or not you want to do philosophy or not do philosophy. The only question then is whether we will do our philosophical thinking reflectively, consistently, and well. And so that's what Bahnsen is challenging us to do here, for us to challenge the other person and for ourselves as well, especially as Christians. We want to have the most consistent worldview. And sometimes even within our own theology, we might run into those opposing things. And so we either need kind of rescuing devices that bridge the gap between what we see as inconsistency, or we should recognize inconsistency and then change our theological beliefs. But we also need a standard for that. And so that's what he's going to talk about.
Right. In fact, so he says that the ordinary man in the street is distinguished from the academic philosopher by his lack of resolve to answer the fundamental questions of life in a consistent, conscious and reflective way. So that's the basic difference. He says the difference between, the ordinary guy on the street and the philosophy professor is one of degree, right?
Not degrees, but
degree. That's right. Yeah, not degrees, but degree. All are philosophers, but not all aim to be good philosophers. And we hope that he's talking about the aim to be good is with the philosophy professor, but, might be one or the other. Right. He says we can take the most uneducated person that right? And at some point in his life, he's going to wonder what is real and what is not real, right? He says everyone has who decides that, for instance, Santa Claus is not real, has practiced some degree of philosophy, right? Because they're making a metaphysical deduction based on their information, right? So is Santa Claus real? Well, when you ask that question, you're doing philosophy.
Yes, and assuming this is still on YouTube 2 years in the future, Cave of the Cross Apologetics does not endorse any view of Santa Claus being real or not real.
Thank you.
And so please do not strike our channel. Thank you, overlords at YouTube. But you can also find us on Odyssey. So I'm still sure there's still free speech there in the future. So, all right. So the process of education systematizes our curiosity and teaches us to reduce our experiences of the world to generalizations. It's what we do in philosophy. It's what we do in science. When you're learning physics, you're kind of learning, okay, well, you kick a football over the field goal is this tall, you started this far out, what's the force required to get the ball over the goalpost? And then apply that to rockets. And so you take our experiences from the world and you kind of generalize them. So that way you can say, oh, I know how to launch a rocket to the moon is the same way you kick a football over the field goal. You just need a bigger foot and to get more oomph into it. And so that's what the rocket fuel helps do. But this is what the process of intellectual growth is all about, and what the educational process tries to develop, or I should say should try to develop, your ability to reduce the diversity of your experiences to certain law-like generalizations. And that's what kind of is helping you to inform your worldview. And especially when we take a look at scripture, we do that where we say, okay, this is God saying, I declare this thing as evil, lying, murder. And so especially if you look at the Western Shorter Catechism, it talks about, this is what the seventh commandment is, the eighth commandment, the ninth, and so on. And so what do we pull that we're required to do? And also what are we required not to do? And so they take these generalities and they say, here's what we know that God hates. And so we need to find similar law-like fashions to inform us on what we shouldn't or shouldn't do. So preserving life is good, including that of your neighbor, because you should build a parapet around your rooftop. And so if anyone happens to sleep up there, including your neighbor, then he doesn't fall. Or make sure your pits are gated off so that your neighbor's bull doesn't fall into there. And if they do, you should pay them a proper
Make the
recompense.
compensation. That's right. Yeah.
And that's what we've done. And those laws there, why the Western world views the 10 Commandments as important is because those models then informed our other things, like if you back into somebody's car and you should have been looking, you should pay the damages for it. And so that generality is applied to the law. And so the law that we have in the Western world is taken from the 10 Commandments as well as a few various other places. And so what the law does then is to try and apply that generally and broadly to everybody, because that's what we view as the fair system here.
Right. Now, and generally, when you're talking about this kind of, reducing your experience to law-like generalizations, really what he's describing here is induction, right? This is what we do with regard to induction. We take particulars and then we say, that's a white swan, that's a white swan, that's a white swan. Therefore, probably all swans are white. So now the law-like generalization is every time that I see a swan, it's going to be white, something like that. So he's really describing the inductive process here in what logicians call induction.
Right.
And
the ugly duckling syndrome. So,
yeah.
Oh, it's just an ugly duckling. Oh, no, wait, hold on. It's the swan.
Right.
It's the white
That's
swan.
Right. And then he moves on. He says, philosophy is resolving differences and conflicts. And he says, so what happens when you start generalizing about your experience in the world is that you find that certain conflicts come to mind. You learn that some people are, pleasant to be around, but other people aren't pleasant to be around, right? And you learn that some people like math, others don't. And so you start realizing that there are differences between human beings when you start this process, right? Notice he's being really general. He's kind of starting at the very beginning because he's working his way up.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's showing one of the reasons why we do philosophy. I think Hans Hermann Hoppe talks about this in his conflict debates or something along those lines is how do we have good discussions? And it can't be both sides have to be equally without the use of force or force used against them in order to have the best type of conversation. And so that's kind of the general point is he's trying to make is, well, instead of fighting for things, as mankind has done for centuries and over very little things like the strip of land between Ohio and Michigan that causes a war between the two states there, let's try talking things out. And so what's the best avenue of talking those things out is having a consistent overview on how to approach those things. But now, what if you were to generalize from that? You might conclude that what makes people happy is relative. Some people are like this. Some people are like that. Therefore, everything is relative. Austrian economics kind of talks about this. It says that people have are view things as important based on relative needs. And so you might want a big house, but your neighbor who doesn't have very many things, is older, unable to walk upstairs, might want that one level house based on their needs or wants. And so what Austrian economics does is say, instead of variabilizing everything and trying to systematize everything, we realize that people make relative choices, but then from there we can then pull out and say, what are the base assumptions that we can make by not systematizing every intricate decision, saying, oh, well, if you were given the option to pay, $500 for a 10,000 square foot house, you would definitely take it. Well, except for those people that wouldn't use it. And so it moves a step back and say, okay, let's look at how people make those relative decisions. And so that's the difference between like Austrian economics and Keynesian economics. Here, most people are relativists and they live comfortably with that relativism. They apply it to everything. They say, oh, well, since people like chocolate ice cream and vanilla ice cream, well, then people that view murder as wrong and view it as just fine are probably just in the same boat. And we just kind of have to live and let live. Well, sadly, that is our culture. They believe that because people have different tastes, then our values are up for grabs just as a matter of whatever pleases you. And
Right. So,
he's going
and
to not make that point.
exactly. So he's describing moral relativism, right? What may be right for you, morally speaking, may not be right for me, morally speaking, and vice versa. Because how do we get there? Well, because people have different tastes, right? Some like chocolate, some like vanilla. So I guess our values are the same way. Some like murder, some like, peace or whatever, right?
Right.
So, and obviously that is not the proper way to, that we shouldn't draw that kind of, conclusion from just because people have different likes, right? But he's suggesting that's kind of the basis of the moral relativism that we see in our society. He says we also learn in physics and chemistry and other hard sciences that there are things that work together in a causal relationship. Right. In fact, he says before you got to school and systematized it, you learned about causal relationships at home. Right. When you put your hand on mom's hot stove, you realize I don't want to do that again. Right. That caused the pain. So hot stove is pain. So I won't do that again. And so he says we grow up and learn certain generalizations about the world. We talk about, he's talked about two of them for us, right? One is that the world operates in a cause and effect, law-like fashion, hot stove pain, right? The other is that everyone is different in some way, right? Some like chocolate, some like vanilla. And so when you ask, how do I bring these two principles together, he says, now we've started doing philosophy. Right? That's what his point is here.
Right. Well, maybe the stove is hot for you, but it's definitely not hot for me. But maybe you should try more, and then I'll see if the tests ring out, and then maybe I'll yeah. So important decisions are made based on your generalizations about the nature of reality, how you know what you know, and how you think you ought to live your life. And we ask these questions like, should we execute murderers? People defend their answer by taking a step back and resting on their generalizations about the world or human nature or whatever it might be. They defend their view on very important issues by falling back to their philosophical assumptions. So talking about, I don't trust the state enough to pave a street. Why should I trust them to execute murderers? And then they might come to face that by saying, well, this murderer has murdered my sister. They're on camera doing it, and they're unrepentant, and they say they're going to do it again. Well, can I still take a step back and say, well, I don't trust the state enough to do this? And so you might come into conflict with that. And so we might have to reevaluate that generalization, or maybe even take a step further back. And so he's saying from these specific instances, we fall back and say, okay, how can I be? We might not have that full force consistency but we're going to look back and try and go back to our generalities to then apply out to the specific instances, like should we execute murders?
Yeah. And so, his next section then says, so what does it mean to do philosophy, right? He says everyone does philosophy, but what does it mean to do philosophy? And he says there are two basic tasks of philosophy. The first one is that there is a critical task. The philosopher cross-examines people's opinions, right? And he says that's the critical task of philosophy. That's where philosophers, are analytical. They try to draw distinctions. They look for logical relationships. They try to get people to make sure that they have evidence for what they say. And, they're not being arbitrary and that sort of thing. So that's the analytical, critical portion of philosophy. That's the critical task of it, he says.
All right. So then he goes on to say, well, philosophy is not limited to the classroom. That's what we kind of think of, like, well, there's philosophers and they sit in their ivory towers and they have surrounded by books and they're unkempt hair and they're just writing. And then they have to go and enter out into the world just to teach their students in order to have food to eat. Well, you can't operate in the world without some view of reality, knowledge, and ethics. So reality, how the world is; knowledge, how we know things; and ethics, how we operate, how we exist, how we do things in the world. Everyone has this basic philosophy. The first task of philosophy, we said, is to critically examine people's assumptions to find reliable presuppositions about metaphysics, that's reality, epistemology, that's knowledge, and ethics, which is kind of the right and wrong, how we know those things, what are the right and wrong things, and the principles for that. These assumptions are the foundation of people's lives. I'm going to get a bus. Why do I wait for the doors to open? Because I believe that those doors are real. They exist. How do I know when to show up at 9:15 for that bus? Why am I confident that the clock that I read on my wrist or on my wall is there? And then also, should I pay the tab for to use the bus as well? Or the driver's looking down and doesn't notice me, so it's fine because he didn't see me. Those are all assumptions that we use. And guess what? You just got on a bus. Congratulations, you've done philosophy.
Yeah.
But if those are the foundations, we also need a roof, something that draws all these areas of life together into what we call a unified worldview.
Yeah, good. So we have the critical portion, the analytical portion, he says, is the foundation, asking these various questions about metaphysics, the study of the nature of reality, and ethics, study of values, and epistemology, the study of knowledge. And so that's the foundation, he suggests, and we ask critical questions about those. But now, what about the roof that we put on the philosophical foundation, he says? And the roof, he says, is answering the question, what's it all about, right? Once we've done our study in literature and history and biology and, physics or whatever, someone must ask the question, what's it all about?
Mm-hmm.
How do we bring it all together is what he's getting at. How do we relate what we've learned in, for instance, political science class to what we learned in literature class to what we learned in psychology lab, experimenting with how, for instance, rats react to stimuli, right? How do we relate all that stuff? How do we bring it together? And so he's suggesting here that's the second major task of philosophy.
Right. So philosophers don't do a lot of good, detailed, interesting stuff in between, but they help us lay a foundation. They help us tie it all together into a worldview. And he gives this definition of a worldview as a network of presuppositions, those most basic convictions we all have about reality, about how we know what we know, and about how we should live our lives. And so that's the definition that he gives for worldview here. And he says, in terms of all experiences, it's all related and interpreted through that set of our most basic convictions. And then sometimes we run into things that fall outside of that. And that's what we talked about with Nancy Pearcey book, Finding Truth, is sometimes people try to build their worldviews and things fall outside the box and they close the box shut and those things get lopped off and those things don't exist, or, that's just an illusion. Those don't really exist in the world. And so we can ignore those. Meanwhile, other people are getting more of the octopus tentacles inside the box.
Yes, yeah. Her point is, if it doesn't fit into our worldview, we kind of cut it off, right? We lop it off, we close the box.
Right. And unfortunately, Christians don't have that ability to do that. We have to get everything inside the box because we say God made everything, so that includes everything. And so we can't leave things that exist outside of the universe, maybe outside the universe, but we don't know about those things, but everything inside the universe, which includes everything. So dog toys and murders all have to fit inside that box.
Yeah. And so he says that worldviews are a package deal, right? A worldview is a network of presuppositions. Those, most basic convictions that we all have about reality, about how we know and how we should live. It's in terms of them, then these things that we evaluate our experience and everything else. They help us tie together all of life and make sense of it, to understand beauty and justice and human dignity and logic and science and the meaning of life and everything. So our worldviews help us to tie everything together to help us to give us, at least from our perspective, based on our worldview, some understanding of the way the world is.
Right. Right. And it's important to note here, too, that, even your most basic person who hasn't thought about these things in those grandiose terms is still operating within that. They have lived experiences. They've built things. There's a consistent-ish nature to how they operate in the world. They get up, they go to work, they come home, they watch TV, they fall asleep. Even within the scope of doing those most basic things, if they only exist to work and then come back home and watch TV and fall asleep, they're still operating with some of these basic understandings that they live the world by and see the world by. Well, there's nothing that really happens. I'm not that important. So as long as I continue to make the widgets at the factory, I can come home. And what's most important to me is watching TV, my favorite shows. And why are those my favorite shows? Because they seem to inspire me to a life of beauty and external heroics. But I'll never live that way because I'm not good enough. I'm not like the people on TV. And so I have to continue to go into work and make my widgets and come back home and live vicariously through them. Even there, that person is still operating in worldview, even if they're not saying, okay, well, what is my ethical epistemology occurring here? It's still being realized out in how we're living. And that's a foundation where we can talk to other people about. And so that's what he's trying to kind of make that point with here.
Right.
All right. So he says, that's why I said a worldview is not tested by natural science. You don't test your ultimate commitments by natural science because natural science also rests upon the commitments. Is the world real? The Matrix, the Hindu view of reality. All things are an illusion. Spiritual worlds, is there an evil genie? All those things are kind of claims against a natural worldview. And so even coming in and interacting with the Matrix, or you're going to spite the evil genie by writing a book about him, you're still operating with a further back commitment to something that you're relying on natural sciences for. You're communicating. You're writing that book, even if it's to the evil genie, even if it's to you that you're writing about, so that you can feel good about yourself in that way, and you're going against the machines or the genie or what have you. You're still taking a step back from the natural sciences, and you're able to look at it, even if you believe it's all an illusion. The very methods of natural science, though, depend upon a particular view of reality. Your network of presuppositions tell you the nature of science, the method you use in science, and how to interpret science. It's not tested by science, right? Can you come up with a all-encompassing view of science that also includes science? Nope, because science is just the method. Well, how do you do a scratch test on the method? How do you distill it? How do you put it on a rocket and shoot it in space to see if it's still true on the other side of the moon? The method, not the ideas of that method. It's only in terms of those fundamental presuppositions that you can do science. If you hold to those, if you believe that there's an intrinsic world, that it can be studied, and if it can be repeated. And that's something that you might see in a lot of debates of having this Humean flaw of saying, well, how do you know what's true today is what's true tomorrow? Yeah, for the past 100 days, the sun has come up. But do you know? How do you know, other than, well, it's just a really good guess that it's happening?
Yeah, it's yeah. So what he does next is kind of give us an illustration of this to kind of help us understand. Let's say that somebody else has a totally different worldview. Well, they may not come up with the scientific ideas that it seems obvious to us. He uses Plato, for instance, right? He said Plato believed that the most ultimate reality was not the physical world, right? It was the realm of ideas or forms. And so if you see three ducks, Plato would tell us, then you must have an idea of duckness, of which they are, instances of this idea of duckness. Okay, so where did the idea of duckness come from? Well, it's not just in our mind. Plato said that the idea of duckness exists outside this world. It's not part of time and space. So there must be a realm of ideas or forms that are beyond this world. That's what Plato argued for, right? So the real reality, we might say, is this the ideas or the forms that exist outside the physical reality. Mm-hmm. Well, now, what does that do with regard to that? Makes science a little bit more difficult to work through, right? If you have an idea. So now the basic reality isn't the physical world. The basic reality is some ideas, some forms that exist beyond the physical world. Right. And the physical world is just the shadow of those ideas. Right.
And so we are two shadows. And so there must be a more perfect form, a more perfect being, one that exists fully and encompassing outside of reality to give us our form. That form would be God, and he holds the perfect triangle, and he holds the perfect duckness, and he holds the perfect cat. And so when you get to heaven, you find you're standing face to face in front of the perfect triangle with a duck in front of it, holding a perfect cat. So we get there standing before the all perfect being. So even with Plato, we can trace our lineage back to God there. But if you have a view of reality that ultimate reality is idea, not flesh and blood, here and now, time and space particulars, then you will not be an empiricist in your theory of knowledge. You will not say, we know what we know because of our senses. If ultimate reality is outside of time and space, then something that is in time and space cannot be the way that you know about it.
Right. And so the point he's making here is that, we take for granted that science is done with a certain method and that sort of thing. But it's based on our worldview. It's based on how we believe things are. If we thought things were different, we had a different worldview, then we would come up with a different idea with regard to, what science is. Right? If ultimate reality is not the physical world, but it's outside time and space and that sort of thing, then how we know what we know and what we know would have to be different, if indeed that's what our worldview held to for us. All right. And so that's the point he's trying to make here, is that the worldviews kind of push us in a particular direction. And even, to do science, we have to make assumptions about the way we believe the world is, right? He says, understanding worldviews has everything to do then with our defense of the Christian faith. Because worldviews are a package deal, he tells us, you need to understand that your Christian commitment means that you have made a commitment for all of life. And it's a package deal, so, each part is part of the whole. So everything you think and everything you do is tied to your Christian commitment.
Right. We see this a lot too, this type of different type thinking when we talk about new age ideas and crystals and Reiki healing and kind of all these stuff of astrology. Things have different vibrations, and it wards off or it changes you in a different way, in a different fashion. And so having, this is just a crystal. I can find a whole bunch of them in a cave underneath a town that is always getting flooded. And so your claim to have this type of crystal ward off the evil elements doesn't seem to be helping them. Oh, well, if you have too much of them, and so that changes the whole makeup, and so you need some bad luck in your life in order to have the good. And so but how do we talk to those type of people? How do we talk to, your white woman friend who tells you that Venus is in Nutrigrade or whatever it might be, and say, well, no, the planet's just out there. It's 93 million miles away, and it'll come around again. And she goes, yes, that's very important. And so when we have these commitments, we have to realize that there are basic assumptions that we make going into it. And so talking and saying, well, here's my concluded outcome. we have to match it up with yours, and they might say, well, that's not what my concluded outcome is, and so that's why we need to take a look at these kind of basic assumptions, these basic beliefs, to kind of get to the root, and then from there we can go forward. Because even with New Ageness, you're still operating on a if then. So you have a if I do this, then this will happen, or if I do too much of this, and so we can still point to flaws within kind of the New Age understanding, and see if we can get agreement there. But I'm sure we'll talk about internal and external critiques, and so that's might be where we're going next. But you need to know as well that the challenge of your Christianity at any point implicitly challenges everything you believe as a Christian, and vice versa as well. When the unbeliever's worldview can be attacked at one point, the unbeliever's worldview is endangered at all points. Understanding what worldviews and philosophies are enables you to do a lot of internal destruction within the unbeliever's worldview, as we'll go on to see. Look right there, internal critiques. It's one of the two-pronged attacks that we can have as presuppositionalists, right there. All right, and so that's the end of chapter 6. So you are all now philosophers, and you were actually all philosophers before this started, but you're even better informed philosophers now. So thanks to Against All Oppositions by Greg Bahnsen, and we're going to continue on next week. Chapter 7, Challenges of Competing Worldviews, and so that's when what happens when people go up to you after you've given a long soliloquy of everything that you know about reality, and they go, I disagree. And so, and so, believe it or not, we come into a world that has many disagreements between people, and instead of fighting each other, let's talk about it. And so we need to define our terms, which Bahnsen has done, and talk about our presuppositions, which Van Til and Apostle Paul and God before everything wanted us to do. He said, do not eat of the tree of the garden. And the serpent said, did he really say? And we should have said, by what standard are we talking to a serpent about these things? And so it would have saved us a lot of issues. But at the same time, we know from What About Evil that God would not see the most amount of glory. And so that's what we're doing here. We're proclaiming God's glory in all that we do and all that we think and all that we believe and say. And so we want to tell other people about that good news. And we have the ability to be saved from ourselves and be able to unite ourselves underneath the true worldview of the one God who rules and reigns in heaven above. So hopefully you get a lot out of this. Bahnsen's always a good challenge, and so we'll turn next week when we come back and talk about the next chapter in his book. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. So thank you. He's and just kind of a teaser here. Next week, he's going to give us a list and a map of worldviews. So he's going to kind of break them all down for us and help us to understand it. So that should be a really interesting chapter. Right.
Yep. There's 2 other books in the series that also help do that as well. And so if you want to pick them up, the links are in the description, caveofthecross.com, for all the books we've done, including this one. So you can follow along, start at the bottom, work your way up for the episodes, and you'll be joining us in the next chapter. And so thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.